All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the episode 33 of our Journal of International Business Studies and Journal of International Business Policy webinar podcast series. In this episode, we will discuss how do multinational enterprises govern social and environmental issues in global supply chain. My name is Stephanie Wang. I am Associate Professor of International Business at Kelley School of Business, Indiana University, and one of the co-hosts of the webinar podcast series. Klaus Meyer, you see here, Professor of International Business from Ivey School of Business. He is the other regular co-host. It is also a great honor to have a guest co-host today, Professor Jonathan Dahl. He's one of the special issue editor today. Welcome. Thank you so much, Jonathan. First of all, I am absolutely delighted to welcome all of you to today's session from various corners of the world. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome, and welcome back to many old friends. So our goal is to create a vibrant platform for exchanging fresh insights and exploring their real-world implication. So in each episode, we carefully select 3 recently published papers from either JIPS or JIP under a common research theme. We not only feature some prominent scholars in the field who have been publishing a lot, but also provide a platform for emerging voices, including younger scholars who might be publishing in our journals for the first time. So today, we are really excited to dive into 3 papers from this special issue. Jonathan will talk a little bit more about that. So these papers tackle different aspects of this critical topic and offer a lot of great insights into this complexity of managing social environmental issue within global supply chain. But it's not just about speakers, it's also about you, the audience. We value your participation and engagement. So we encourage you to ask questions and share your thoughts in the Q&A function in Zoom. So at the bottom of your screen, you should see a button says Q&A. You can write your question there. And you can also like some of the questions, which will make the question move up in the list. So that brings attention to us. All right, without further ado, I will hand over the floor to our guest host today, Professor Jonathan Dahl.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. It's really exciting for me to join you, my good friend, and the rest of the panelists on this very timely webinar. As Stephanie alluded to, this webinar is actually built around a couple of papers that appeared in a special issue that I had the pleasure of co-editing. And I'm just going to show you briefly the overall message and the overall contribution of the special issue, and then the 3 papers that you'll be hearing from today, as well as 2 others. I learned a lot in this process from handling the papers, from looking at some of the connections and integration. It's, as I said, it's a very timely topic in the news almost on a weekly basis. Some of these papers are already available online. A couple we're just finishing up, and the special issue we hope will be available later this year. So please do look for that. So without further ado, our first presenter is Alvaro Cuervo-Cazurra. He's going to be talking about his co-authored paper, How Subsidiary and Supplier Misbehavior Lead to Corporate Social Responsibility Performance Improvements in Multinationals. Over to you, Alvaro.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you, Klaus and Stephanie, for including me in this webinar. It's a fantastic opportunity to share not only the paper, but also have an interaction with other authors of papers and also the audience on this very timely and I think very important topic of what happens with corporate social responsibility, what happens with supply chains, and how do we basically provide a better understanding of the behavior of multinationals in their global network. So what I'd like to discuss is a paper that I have co-authored with Cheng Li from University of Manitoba, and here, as Jonathan mentioned, it's a long title, and it's basically trying to capture everything that we have done here, which is both supplier and subsidiary misbehavior, leading to better corporate social responsibility in multinationals. How is this that this is the case? To some extent, we are trying to go against a simplistic view of the behavior of multinationals. So with this, let me go through some of the core ideas. I'm not going to go deep into the specifics, mostly because the paper is already available online. So if you want to understand better what we have explained, you can always read the paper. But nonetheless, let me go basically into some of the core ideas and then abstract from there. We start with a relatively simple quote. Takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it. Why is this important? Mostly because the story that we have understood about multinationals and in particular companies in general, that they have to create a good perception among stakeholders, not only consumers and shareholders and employees, but basically the broader social contracts with all stakeholders. And as a result, many of them have decided that, well, CSR is good. CSR is something that some cases we are required to do. In other cases, we choose to do. And these are investments. And this is not something that it's just greenwashing and making a few changes here and there, but these are real investments. There are capital investments. If you're running a company, you always want to basically get an idea of what am I going to get out of these investments. And the literature, for the most part, we have now come to an agreement that CSR investments are good. If you invest in CSR, in some cases, you are going to create sources of competitive advantage. Your customers are going to perceive you as a better company. Your employees are going to like working for you. Investors are going to think that because you have a higher CSR, you are more likely to have a better future and therefore are going to reduce the cost of capital. And in some cases, this is going to lead to growth in the company and overall, some multinational, better performance in pretty much every single dimension. So to some extent, we have come to this agreement. However, what happens with multinationals? Multinationals are really complex companies. They operate in large networks of relationships. And the result is that they are not always able to behave as they expect. They have far-flung subsidiaries, they have suppliers in other countries, and it's difficult to coordinate and know exactly what is happening. And in some cases, they face problems in their suppliers or their subsidiaries. The result is that this is one of the, if you want, sources of concern about the behavior of multinationals. It has, once upon a time, to some extent, we knew little about it, but now thanks to the free press and the concerned citizens on what companies are doing, interest groups, we know much better about what happens with multinationals, faraway countries, what happens with their subsidiaries, their suppliers, issues of labor problems, child labor, bribery, pollution, lead paint in the case of Mattel. These are things that are happening, and the result is that all of a sudden we are running a company and we have no idea that we had a problem. The problem is on the front page of newspapers. That's the last thing you want to do because all of a sudden you have a big problem regarding your reputation. So with this, what are we trying to do? Understand how this major misbehavior leads to basically changes in CSR. A very simplistic approach. And this is the one that we think most people, we think, oh, you have a problem, therefore your CSR, your reputation is going to take a hit, is going to be a problem. Yeah, we can take this, but we can also take a much more sophisticated approach, and this is what we are going to argue, which is companies are active agents, managers want to solve things, they don't just basically are passive receivers of the misbehavior, and they are going to take action. And they're not going to take only action in the misbehaving supplier or subsidiary, but also they basically going to change many of the practices throughout the multinational. The result of these multinational-wide changes is that we end up with companies that, because they are hit with a major misbehavior, nonetheless, later on, they are going to have higher CSR because they try to not only change the problematic supplier or subsidiary, but basically change all the operations throughout the multinational. So this is the main argument. How do we basically connect these two previous literature? CSR as a strategic tool. CSR as basically a way for companies to understand the relationship with the stakeholders. And here we argue that we have two main sources of strategic use for CSR. The more traditional one is CSR as a source of competitive advantage. Here, you invest in CSR, you invest in relationships with society, you try to reduce your environmental impact. There is a perception that you are going to do better, and you are basically building a reputation for being a better company. Typical example, if you want, is Patagonia, which is a company that produces hiking and gear, and they have built this idea that we are concerned about the environment, we are going to build proactively our reputation. An alternative is that, well, it's going to be later on, there is some misperception about, in many cases, country of origin. There are some issues, so you are trying to basically rebuild your legitimacy. You might not have a good reputation. You are going to invest there to basically try to build that competitive advantage, even though initially you did not have them. The alternative one, which is one that is to some extent less studied in the literature, is a story of risk management. CSR as a risk management tool, you do things to basically deal with problems. One approach is building insurance. So let me invest in social issues, let me invest in environmental issues, so that if later on we have a problem, we have built to some extent buffer of goodwill with our stakeholders, and as a result, we are not going to suffer as much as if we didn't have it. And the final one, which is the one we propose, is rebuilding reputation. So you are facing a major problem with some of your subsidiaries or suppliers, and your major investments in CSR are going to be coming after that to basically compensate for the breach of the social contract with the stakeholders. So these are the four ways in which we can think of CSR as a strategic tool, and this is the one that we are presenting, the fourth one. With this, what we propose, CSR as an ex-post risk management tool to compensate for network partners, suppliers, and subsidiaries' major misbehavior. So, separating misbehavior in subsidiaries and suppliers. This is important mostly because much of the literature is focusing either on one or the other. There is a lot of discussion and especially lots of examples on how, we have a problem with our suppliers. We didn't know that the quality was so bad. And all of a sudden we have to deal with it. We have to do some recalling. Or all of a sudden there is this problem with the subsidiary. We didn't know that they were bribing in another country. We have to do something about it. Let's put them together. Let's see whether these are basically completely different stories, or we can get into a broader, better understanding of the misbehavior within the network and what happens with CSR.
Alvaro, I'm sorry to interrupt. You got about 2 minutes left, please.
Okay. And then basically we propose that home country mandates modify this. So with this, the first one is I'm going to basically try to compensate for the problems in my subsidiary. There might be a perception of governance and organizational culture. These are problematic, so I'm going to change everything, not only the problems in the subsidiary, and I'm going to do something similar with the suppliers. There is a problem with the supplier, I'm going to change my relationship with suppliers so that there is less problems with the selection and the contract management. And then, depending on the home country, the traditional baseline, if you have a home country that there is a mandate for CSR, you're going to invest more in it, that's baseline. But there is going to be making you more reactive, more attuned to problems in your network, and therefore you are going to react much more faster. With this, 8,000 companies, ESG scores, and of course, this is an empirical paper. You cannot see this, but what we find is in effect, these main effects, there is a separate effect of major supplier and subsidiary effects on CSR. Home country CSR does have an effect, and we do find that in the case of it is the issue of suppliers rather than subsidiaries, the ones that solve this. And then in robustness tests, we did some additional analysis, and what we find is it is the major supplier misbehavior that tend to lead to higher external CSR, while major subsidiary misbehavior tends to lead to higher internal CSR. So contributions. One story of CSR as an ex-post tool to for compensating for Meyer misbehavior. And another complementary story of CSR mandates are not only good for improving CSR in the home country, but also basically for improving the reaction of companies to problems. So in essence, we basically argue for CSR as atonement. If there is a problem, you are going to invest, you are going to be so much better because you want to basically compensate for the problems and not have future problems. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alvaro. Appreciate you moving along there quickly. Our goal here is for the presenters to give kind of an overview and a snapshot of their research, and then we can have a discussion and take some Q&A alongside of that. Our second presenter is Wenjie Liu. His paper is co-authored with Percy Huggins. It is titled Cross-Sector Collaborations in Global Supply Chain as an Opportunity Structure, How NGOs Promote Corporate Sustainability in China. Over to you, Wenjie.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. It is my honor to share our work at the AIB Channel's webinar. And first off, I would like to ask a question to all of you. That is, how would you label the 56% of the countries in the world? So you can type your answer in the chat box. Let's see what you think. And whatever, there could be chocolate or dog or whatever. Okay, so since I only have 10 minutes and Jonathan is a very strict person, so I will continue now. So according to the Economist Intelligence Unit, 50% of all states in the world can by now be labeled as wholly or partially autocratic. And depending on the measures, the number may vary a bit, but it is around 50%. But even though the majority of the states in the world are ruled by autocratic regimes, we have exceedingly little knowledge about how political constraints associated with autocratic regimes influence organization behavior and management practices. So in this paper, Percy and I ask ourselves how Chinese NGOs, which are under close surveillance by Chinese government and which have limited room to maneuver, can still put sufficient pressure on local supply chain to bring them to more sustainable practices. So in the current literature, scholars have emphasized that the challenge of pushing the sustainability concerns upstream to the supply chain partners of multinational firms. And this challenge is rooted in the contextually embedded nature of global supply chains, so leading to information asymmetry between these MNEs and their distant suppliers. But little attention has been paid to the collaborative opportunities created by this challenge that might be exploited by non-government organizations, NGOs in autocratic countries. This is probably because most of this research has so far focused on the Western countries, in which NGOs can use several tactics to influence corporate decision makers, and they found that contentious tactics like protests or boycotts are more legitimate and more effective than cooperative ones. But in autocratic countries, civil society is subservient to the government, and contentious targeting of the firms is considered as a source of chaos and anomie and is strictly prohibited. So the opportunity to collaborate with downstream actors or the MNE buyers of the local firms is maybe one of the few options for NGOs to gain leverage over local firms and promote sustainability. So this paper aims to offer a newly theorized conception of NGOs' role in autocratic contexts to better understand the extension of sustainability practices from MNEs to local supply chain partners. And the basic ideas in our framework is that when the focal party, namely NGOs, seek to gain influence over another party, these local firms, but unfavorable power relationship make direct bilateral power restructuring operations untenable, the focal body can still achieve the objective by seeking to collaborate with a third party on whom the party it attempts to influence depends, so namely those foreign MEs based on the local firms being linked to these foreign MEs. So we draw on the social movement and the resource dependence theory to argue that global supply chains that tie ME to their local partners offer NGOs constrained by autocratic political regimes an opportunity structure to gain leverage over local firms by establishing ME-NGO collaborations. And NGOs can collaborate with MEs by acting as external information intermediary, therefore allowing ME to pressurize their upstream partner to improve sustainability performance. And these two-step form of leverage enable NGO to achieve their objective without risking conflict with the government, which may not approve the NGO exerting direct pressure on local firms. So we call this a two-step leverage model. And we find that, so to test our theory, we examine the relationship between Chinese NGOs in environmental collaboration with 167 MEs across 24 countries, and these MEs green supply chain rating in China in the period 2014-2020. And we designed an instrumental variable approach based on two historical events, specifically Chinese province treaty ports after the First Opium War with the British and between the 1842 and 1943, and the liberation timing by the Chinese PRC's Liberation Army between 1946 and 1951. And this Ivey approach renders support for causal identification of our focal relationship, and also additionally suggests that Chinese NGOs' willingness to collaborate with foreign MEs is shaped by the civil society logic imprinted by the global West and is relatively independent of the party-state logic prescribed by the Chinese government. And our paper presents a new theory and evidence on how ME-NGO collaborations affect the global diffusion of sustainability practices and contribute to several literatures. First, we advance the social movement theory by developing a novel framework for identifying opportunity structure based on inter-organizational ties. So current literature often conceptualizes opportunity structure as structural characteristic of the target itself. And in contrast, we conceptualize opportunity structure as a product of the target's ties to other organizations. And second, we also contribute to the literature on ME-NGO collaboration by identifying how the notion of inter-organizational opportunity structure enrich our understanding of the political landscape this kind of collaboration involve. And in so doing, we create a deeper understanding of when and how such collaboration will form and deteriorate. And we also expand our understanding of how local NGO facilitates the diffusion of sustainability practices from MEs to local supply chain partners. And we show that local NGOs can help address structuring information asymmetry between MEs and local supply chain partners. And regarding the future research, we think it will be interesting to further unpack the complex ME-NGO collaborations along the global supply chain. For example, one may ask when and why certain MEs can be better partners to channel this influence, and how do the players involved in this collaborative process respond to the turbulent social movements, including the rise of nationalism and the political polarization, and how do societal crises affect this kind of collaboration. And to understand the process of opportunity structure is identified, effectuated, and or redirected to other direction. One may employ different methods to further tease out the distinct mechanism involved. And in addition, future research may want to challenge the idea that the demand for NGO is weak in countries with low civil society freedom. So further research could examine the differences in the extent to which NGO based in varying institutional contexts result to collaborative arrangements to respond to a target to which they have no direct access, but also still in the ME's global supply chains. And on the other hand, one could also explore the dual internalization of both NGOs and MNEs. So for example, how do these local seemingly toothless NGOs could transform the role of MNE from part of the problem, the grand challenge, to part of the solution? And how do international NGOs influence MNE's activities in non-democratic countries? So I believe there are a host of interesting questions we could unpack. So this was what I wanted to share. Look forward to discussion. Back to you, Jonathan. Thanks.
Thank you, Wenjie. Very interesting. Appreciate the presentation. As a reminder to the audience, please do post questions in the Q&A. You can certainly do at the end, but if you have them during the presentations, feel free to do this. I would just want to underscore that I think this particular topic really lends itself to discussions about research impact and societal impact. And so even if your question is not directly related to a paper, if you would like any of the panelists to comment on some things that are going on in your world with respect to sustainability and supply chains, feel free to throw them their way as well. Our third presenter is Christian Asmussen. He has a co-authored paper. This one's a conceptual theory development paper called Corporate Social Responsibility in the Global Value Chain, a Bargaining Perspective. Over to you, Christian.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thanks to Klaus and Stephanie for organizing this and for inviting us here to share our research. So I want to start with, you could say, the observation a little bit by Alvaro that there's misbehavior among M&E suppliers, and that these things might undermine M&E CSR strategies because of the damage to their social reputation and stuff like that. And we argued in this paper that the international business literature has focused a lot on the M&E in terms of saying what can the M&E do to solve the problem, but that there are some trends that make this particularly difficult. And the first one being is that emerging market suppliers are becoming more and more sophisticated. So in other words, the M&E doesn't necessarily always have most of the power, and that's sort of reinforced by the fact that there's often an asymmetry in the reputational vulnerability, where the M&Es often have much more to lose than the suppliers have in terms of their reputation. And this means that the M&Es can be put in difficult bargaining positions against their own suppliers when it comes to CSR issues. That's sort of what we examine in this paper. And I want to illustrate it with sort of this type of bargaining situation with a case by Bartlett and others about IKEA, which actually has inspired the model in the paper. And in this contract, or in this paper, IKEA has a problem with a supplier which is exposed in the media to be using child labor. And IKEA has contracts that says, child labor cannot be used, and this is on pain of termination. In other words, there's a termination clause in the contracts. Right. So when IKEA would say something like that to the supplier could say, first of all, that they don't agree, and also they would say they could be willing to renegotiate the contract, because contracts can always be renegotiated when both parties are actually interested in that. Of course, IKEA would say, we refuse to renegotiate, we have a zero tolerance policy, and so on. But the supplier could say, maybe we could work together, we could try to fix these problems, and in the process, make the world a better place. So this creates a dilemma, and this dilemma is very nicely described actually in the case by Christopher Bartlett and colleagues. So I strongly recommend that. And what the problem that IKEA faces is when they take a cost-benefit analysis to should they walk away from this negotiation situation, or should they stay with the supplier? The consequences of walking away will be that they are going to lose sales, they're going to disappoint their customers who have ordered this product. Then they have to find a new supplier, which will give them a lot of search costs and other problems. They have to train that new supplier to deliver to IKEA's product specifications. They have to maybe go to the second best supplier, so the new supplier might not be as cost efficient or as good quality as the first one. We don't know whether another supplier would also use child labor. And what will happen to the children if we walk away from this negotiation? So there's also social issues that could occur here. And in addition, the reputational damage to IKEA's brand has already occurred, and walking away from the contract is not going to sort of magically make this problem disappear in the memories of consumers and stakeholders. So most likely, IKEA is going to say, let's renegotiate. And that is sort of a pattern that we think we see in many multinational firms in the relationships with their suppliers. So, for example, will Apple be a way to walk away when Foxconn is exposed to have some problematic labor practices? Probably not, because Foxconn is sort of a very important partner for Apple with some sophisticated capabilities, and nobody can produce iPhones as sort of quickly, as cost effectively as Foxconn can. And what about Tesla? Will Tesla be able to walk away from Glencore when there are sort of stories about horrible conditions in the mines where Glencore is mining the cobalt, which goes into the electric batteries that Tesla is using? Again, probably not, because they are highly reliant on these minerals, and Glencore is by far the largest and most sophisticated player in that industry, mining those minerals. So, threats to terminate irresponsible suppliers, in other words, are not always credible threats. And that inherently is a game theoretic issue, because game theory talks about credible threats and cheap talk. So that's why we use game theory to model this issue, to try to sort of extract additional insights from it. And so the timeline of the model is very simple. I'm not going to sort of say so much about it, maybe show it with this graph here, that first of all, they can make a deal or not make a deal. Then we go down so that the supplier can choose to be responsible or irresponsible. If the supplier is irresponsible, there's a risk that the irresponsible action is detected. And if it is detected, IKEA can choose to either terminate the supplier or work with the supplier to fix the problem. And then we derive sort of payoffs using bargaining theory in each of these scenarios. And I'm not going to sort of, in the interest of time, I'm not going to show you I'm not going to talk about all the calculations at least. But what we can see here, just going through the first two ones, is that when the supplier is irresponsible and not detected by the outside world, then both the supplier and the multinational firm actually earns a higher profit. And that sort of speaks to, let's say, the cynical view of the multinational firms as being sort of knowing very well what's going on, right? So you could say the multinational firm here also reaps the cost savings that the supplier is getting from their irresponsible behavior. And that speaks also to some work that Alvaro has done, actually, and sort of this idea of whether firms are cynical or whether these things are happening by mistake. We then sort of look at what happens if it actually is detected, and we can see here that the termination option is not very attractive. And the reason for that is that the reputational damage has already been occurred, and it's not going to disappear if IKEA or the M&E walks away from the negotiation. And that gives the supplier actually an upper hand in the renegotiation stage and makes the multinational firm vulnerable to hold up. And we show that, and that's sort of the main proposition and the main finding of the paper, that when a supplier has been detected by the outside world to have done something irresponsibly, then there's going to be a hold-up problem in the renegotiation between the M&E and the supplier. And that's going to lead to a low payoff for the M&E and a relatively high payoff for the supplier. And this is more likely to happen when the reputational benefit to the M&E from terminating the relationship is low, but also when the M&E has limited bargaining power and experiences large reputational damage. And this sort of a condition B that's exactly what we described in the beginning, with the examples of Apple and Foxconn or Tesla and Glencore, right? So these are examples of cases where there's limited bargaining power for the M&E because of the importance of the supplier to the M&E's business. And at the same time, there's an asymmetry in the reputational damage, that the M&E is sort of much more reliant on its brand and its reputation than the supplier is. So, so that gives us this game. And when we solve it using backwards detection, we can see that, or backwards induction, we can see that the M&E will be willing to work with the supplier to fix the problem. It will be irrational to fire the supplier at that point in time. The supplier knows this, and therefore the supplier is rational to actually be irresponsible. So they're counting on the M&E's rationality, you could say, in not terminating them after being detected. So right, so we can say sort of different things about this. And we show in the paper different scenarios that can occur. You could say this is a problem for the M&E. It's also a problem for the supplier, because they could actually both earn more if the supplier could commit to being responsible, and they could commit to be responsible if the M&E could commit to terminate an irresponsible supplier. But these sort of credible threats do not exist, and that's sort of what creates the problem. There are also scenarios in our model where the M&E actually would like the supplier to be irresponsible and take the blame for it. That's what we call a scapegoating scenario. But I want to say a little bit about the managerial implications here at the end. So what can the M&E do? And one of the things the M&E can do is what we call social branding. So it can, that's proposition 2 in the paper. The M&E can actually invest in, let's say, advertising its code of conduct and its zero tolerance policy very aggressively, so that it looks bad if it does not actually follow through on those. So that would serve as a commitment device, and that's why we think social branding and advertising actually could have some real effects also. So it's not only sort of symbolic CSR in that sense, it also has a commitment effect. Then we look at monitoring, and we find that monitoring also has some problems, specifically that monitoring can also put the M&E in a bad bargaining position, especially if the M&E has not committed to announcing what it finds when it monitors. If it can commit to announcing that, then it would be in a better position. And we argue that it can do that by working with NGOs, which then would serve as a commitment device to announcing irresponsible actions that it finds in its supply chain. So that also speaks to Wenjie's paper on, or Wenjie's call for, you could say, unpacking the M&E NGO interaction, where in addition to the legitimacy argument and the core competency argument for working with NGOs, we think there's also a commitment argument that could be useful in the relationship with suppliers. So that's the conclusions that the hold-up problems can occur not only with relationship-specific investments, which we know very well from economics, but also in relation to CSR issues when M&Es work with their suppliers. And the key thing to take away from M&Es is to pursue these credible commitments. So credible commitments to either terminate relationships with irresponsible suppliers, we argued social branding could help with that, or to announce publicly issues discovered through monitoring, and we argued that they could work with NGOs to actually accomplish that. So yeah, that's it for me in first round. We're looking forward to the debate and to questions.
Thank you, Christian. Yes, please do put your questions or comments in the Q&A. I'm going to begin with one that Alvaro actually answered in the Q&A, but I think it's broad enough that it's worthy of a little bit of discussion. So one of our other co-authors of a paper in the special issue, Lutz Prus, asked Alvaro the following. In the supply chain literature, there is a distinction between a sphere of influence in supply chains and a sphere of concern, where a buying company may have misgivings over supplier CSR performance, but lack the opportunity to influence that tier in its supply chain. How would this fit with your model? And Alvaro, I know you've had a chance to think about this, but please share your thoughts with the rest of the group.
Thank you. Great question. Once upon a time, you will argue that, well, I don't know what is happening with my supply chain. I'm not responsible. I'm not concerned about it. That's no longer the case. Nowadays, thanks to the free press, interest groups, and everybody who has a smartphone, basically everything is known. And there is an expectation that you will be responsible for what happens not only with your direct suppliers, but your secondary, third, and basically all the way back. So what I will say is it's pretty much the same story. You cannot claim that there is a problem I don't know. You're basically going to be affected by that and have to address it. Can you address it directly? Maybe not directly, but basically through your supply chain. If there is a second or third level supplier, you basically start with your first level supplier and it's why do we have this problem? What is this coming from? And you basically go and identify all the way back to what happened. An example, Mattel, which is a big toy manufacturer, some 10 years ago, they faced problems that there was lead paint in their toys. Huge problem because little children put everything in their mouth and the lead is toxic. And they basically went all the way back, I think, to the 5th level supplier who was, because of cost pressures, taking shortcuts on this. They were basically expected to address the issue. They ended up addressing this. They ended up changing the supply relationships and establishing much better controls over the whole supply chain. It's not something that you can basically claim, well, I cannot influence it, I cannot do anything about it. It's no longer the case now. There is an expectation that companies will take responsibility for all their network of activities.
Thank you, Alvaro. I should mention that in the introductory article to the special issue, which should be available in a couple of weeks, I and my co-authors contrast two versions of this desire to provide broader responsibility in the supply chain. The first we call cascading responsibility, where each supplier essentially outsources the responsibility to the one further out, versus this notion of full chain responsibility, where the focal company is literally taking responsibility all the way back through the supply chain, which obviously is very difficult and challenging, but it's part of the increasing expectations of stakeholders. Wenjie, I'm going to ask you a question that I've actually asked you before, so I hope you're well prepared for it. And that is that your research in some ways is very specific to the Chinese environment. It is true that other autocratic regimes also put constraints on the way that NGOs can operate. But I wonder if you could share with us your thought about whether the same phenomenon that you observe in China, we would see in Russia, North Korea, other autocratic regimes, and whether you've actually had an opportunity to observe how that unfolds in these other contexts.
So, Jonathan, thanks for this question regarding the generalizability of our findings. So indeed, our empirical context is very specific to the Chinese context, but regarding the theoretical framework, we try to generalize it to other autocratic contexts. So the basic idea is quite simple regarding there are multiple dependencies, and some are unfavorable and some are favorable to the focal actor. So we basically see that these NGOs can make use of these favorable dependencies, especially here, they could gain the influence over local companies by leveraging the power of these foreign MNEs based on the assumption that there's some higher mutual dependence between the local firms and the foreign MNEs. So we trust that these two-step leverage model should be readily generalizable to other autocratic contexts. So this is also why we want to encourage future research to perhaps conduct a comparative institutional analysis to see to what extent these NGOs based in different institutional contexts, they resort to the collaborative governance arrangement, and under what conditions this kind of collaboration could be more effective or less effective. So this could be an avenue for future research to examine whether our findings also hold in other autocratic countries, like you mentioned, Russia, North Korea. But theoretically speaking, we believe that our argument should readily generalizable to this autocratic context.
Thank you, Wenjie. Another exchange you and I have had previously is the case that in China, some NGOs are really arms of the government. They're really extensions of the government. We call them gongos. And so you don't need to answer this now, but I think it's another thing for us to think about how the nature of an NGO is qualitatively different from one country to another, both in terms of its mission, but also its governance structure. Christian, I have a question for you with regard to the game theoretic model. In some ways, yours is a single round game, and you're not explicitly coordinating in what might have happened in past rounds. And I'm wondering if you had a chance to reflect on some of the reputational harm that firms carry forward when they enter the round that you're focused on, or conversely, reputational benefits that they carry in, and how that might change your sort of recommended outcome in terms of sticking with the supplier and trying to work through the problem.
Hi, that's an excellent question, and actually something we also talk about in the sense that you could say this problem that we're showing is connected to something called the chain store paradox, which is a thing in economics where when you have these repeated games and you want to do preemptive strategies that sort of scare off future entrants. In a similar way here, if you have a repeated game where new suppliers are coming in, as needed, and in every instance you sort of you can fire so you can show that you can fire suppliers in the initial rounds, which will give you a reputation or maybe make the suppliers think that your payoffs are in such a way that you actually for psychological reasons even, or for other reasons, like to terminate irresponsible suppliers, and that will have a benefit further down the game. So in other words, if the M&E is sufficiently far-sighted, and if there is like a population of new suppliers that can come in, right? And again, that might not be the case for, if the suppliers are companies like Glencore or Foxconn. There's not a number of those types of firms maybe waiting in line to work for you. But in other cases, it might actually work well with let's say smaller suppliers, right? So you fire them sort of to make an example, terminate some irresponsible suppliers there, and that should incentivize future suppliers also to do that. So that's absolutely a possibility.
Yeah, this gets, I think, to the insurance value of CSR and its ability potentially to protect against risks. And I think in some ways, I find that to be among the most powerful rationales for CSR in a strategic sense. That it's not necessarily reputational gains, but it's minimizing reputational losses. I see Stephanie has a question.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. I'm leveraging the advantage being a host, ask some question. So thank you so much, Alvaro, Wenjie, and Christian. Great paper, great insights. So I saw some of the questions the audience asked, a lot of questions related to data. So we know that data constraint is probably one of the constraints we have to face in conducting, cutting edge research like ESG supply chain. So I wonder, in addition to data, something else, have you encountered any of the constraints when you theorizing or writing the paper or framing? How do you solve some of the obstacles with your co-author team? I think it's so interesting because the three paper looking at ESG in supply chain from different lenses and also different unit of analysis as well. So we're looking at different stakeholder, suppliers, subsidiary, NGOs, and then also looking at theorizing, right? So I think you will provide really complementary insights to our audience. We all know that publishing in prestigious journals like JIPS is like so hard. Reviewers so critical. So any insights you can share, any obstacles you face, and some things, takeaways our audience can learn from that.
Why don't we go in the order of the presentation? So Alvaro, maybe first.
Thank you. Data is an issue, especially in ESG, I think, because we don't have an agreement of what we are measuring. And let me explain this. We have a variety of data providers. We rely on companies that externally assess the ESG dimensions of companies, different from financial performance, in which everything comes concentrated into basically money, and it's easy to compare across companies. With ESG, we have dimensions that are not amenable to be basically grouped into one single unit. So we end up with indicators. It's better than nothing. So let me put it this way. It is good that now we are talking about responsibility of companies. It is good that now we are trying to basically have companies that incorporate their impact on society, the environment, how well they are running things within the company. It is better than before, in which the only focus was on performance, financial performance. Still, we do have some issues on which data sets we are using, what they are actually trying to measure. Many of the data sets that are issued by financial companies are about how do you reduce the risk of ESG on your company rather than the performance, ESG performance of the company as such. There are others that basically rate companies in terms of how transparent you are about your impact on society and the environment rather than how well you are trying to basically incorporate your impact. So to some extent, if you want, the less known discussion is that unlike what happens with financial performance, with ESG, we still have a way to go in terms of having accurate measures of the impact of companies on society and the environment. And yes, we can use annual reports. The challenge with that is that they are not comparable across companies because companies focus on their materiality. They focus on what they think is important for the company and stakeholders, and we cannot really compare what they are doing.
That's a great segue to Wenjie, because Wenjie, in the qualitative portion of your paper, you did look at annual reports. And I wonder if you could comment upon that portion of your research, whether you were able to find some apples to apples comparisons, or whether it was difficult, as Alvaro mentions.
Yes, so indeed, so we we analyzed more than 200 ME reports and around 50 NGO reports to help us to unpack the mechanisms we could not really unpack through our quantitative data. So it plays a significant role in terms of at least convincing the reviewers that the story is true, and this on one hand, and on the other hand, it also unveils some new insights. For example, these NGOs and MEs are actually upgrading the collaborations. So our quantitative hypothesis is that the main effect will be weakened when government involved in, but our qualitative analysis unveils that they're actually doing something going beyond what the government could do. So the qualitative part could complement, collaborate. So I think it is a very insightful part in the paper.
Thank you, Wenjie. I should, in truth in advertising, I handled both Wenjie's paper and Christian's paper as editor, so I'm very familiar with them. I think in your paper, Wenjie, with Percy, the fact that you did approach it from a multi-method perspective, I think, was very attractive to reviewers. And I think the approach to the instrumental variable was also reassuring to them that what you were finding was really what you were finding. Christian, yours is a theory paper. We don't see many at all these days in IB. I mean, I can't even think of others that I would come to. What challenges did you face? Again, I experienced them as well, but I'm wondering from your perspective, what challenges did you face in trying to convey the value of this theory development paper?
Yeah, I think I think a challenge that always is there when you develop let's say a theory paper, and especially maybe a formal modeling based theory paper like this one is sort of to let's say build the model on some data actually, and there I'm talking about qualitative data, right? So in addition to the quantitative data, I think qualitative data like case studies are always very important in this sense, and you could say this paper basically it takes these cases that I mentioned also in the presentation and tries to construct a model so that the assumptions of the model reflect some of what's going on in those cases, right? And then the rest is sort of just mathematical deduction, right? And then you get some predictions in the end, and of course those predictions could also have empirically testable implications, which then would need the type of quantitative data that the two other papers, right, are talking about. So yeah, but I agree that the quantitative data, and we have in several of these papers with models, we have thought about, could we and how should we test the predictions of the model empirically, but also many of the models we have like we distinguish between the symbolic and the substantive CSR, and the substantive CSR almost by definition is difficult to observe, right? Because it's something that takes place behind the scenes a little bit, whereas the symbolic CSR, advertising, sustainability reports, those things could perhaps be measured more clearly looking at sustainability reports and stuff like that.
Yeah, I would just also mention, agree with you that I think having some of these little case examples really helps with face validity, because many reviewers are not familiar with the formal modeling. And that was another thing that I encouraged Christian and his authors to take some of that and put it in the appendix, because in the original versions, you had page after page of equations, and I think it was just too much for a general IB audience. There was a question in the chat that maybe I will ask Alvaro to comment upon. and it has to do with the trade-off between the stakeholder expectations in the home country and the host country. And I think the implication here is that in an advanced industrialized country, perhaps attention to ecological and environmental priorities might be high, whereas in a developing country market, perhaps the societal side might be more emphasized. So you referred in the Q&A to a paper, but I'm wondering if you could just comment briefly on that, Alvaro.
Thank you. This is a paper I co-wrote with a couple of co-authors, and it's pretty much that idea. If you think about CSR, ESG in advanced economies, we tend to focus on the environmental side, mostly because investments by governments in the social side take care of many of the problems there. In emerging economies, it's very different. The expectation is that we are a developing country. We need to basically achieve development. The social side is important. Environmental, we'll take care of it later. Let's first develop and basically have our citizens and our customers, our employees to have a better life. And this is a tension that I think is important because we tend to impose, in many cases, our view from advanced economies in expectations in emerging economies. And the reality is, if you go to emerging economies, the characteristics of the context basically drive a lot of the relationships. And that's pretty much, if you want, the essence and the beauty of a global strategy and international business, in which we take into account how the context affects strategic relations.
Thank you, Alvaro. I'm not seeing any other questions in the Q&A, so maybe I would ask kind of a final one. And if we have others, we can certainly take them. But Alvaro, you and I have discussed and debated a little bit about the role and relevance of different stakeholder groups in urging CSR or sustainability behavior on the part of firms. And some believe that government is still a critical and key stakeholder in encouraging, say, responsibility through the supply chain. You, Alvaro, have talked about consumers as being an important constituency. And I think I've challenged you because I think of consumers as not very well organized and very disparate and rarely coming together in a collective that's powerful enough to influence CSR behavior. So maybe I'll leave you with that, Alvaro, but I'll ask Christian Wenjie first to comment upon how you see the role and relevance of different stakeholders in your research with respect to influencing responsibility through the supply chain. Christian, why don't I start with you?
Sorry. Yeah, I think that's a great question, and that's something that's very central to our models. Is also, I think, the modeling the reputation damage, right, that occurs both for the suppliers and for the M&Es, and I think that's sort of where the stakeholders come in, and you can get a lot of interesting sort of results based on how you think about that, right? For example, we assume that the consumers penalize M&Es on the branding revenue side when they observe something bad going on in the supply chain. But you can also maybe think about what happens if the M&E terminates the supplier. Will they then get a reputation damage discount, right? And you could think about other types of discount as well. If the M&E sort of commits to doing something and then not doing it, maybe that would sort of increase the distance really between the reputation damage that you get when you terminate a supplier versus when you work with them and so on. So I think that's crucial. You could say that in our model, since our model are essentially models of profit maximizing multinational firms, it's the only thing you could say are the stakeholder effects through the reputation damage. It's the only thing that creates the rationale for the M&Es to actually solve these problems in their supply chains.
Thank you. How about you, Wenjie? Again, your research is looking at kind of the interactions between and among governments, firms, and NGOs. So I'm wondering how you see the relative weights or influence of those actors in the dynamic that you researched in your work.
Yeah, so thanks for raising this question. I think this is particularly relevant in our context in terms of looking at this interaction between MEs, NGOs, and governments. And indeed, we do see some evolution or confluence of the relationship. So this actually related to a question I asked during the presentation. Why would these MNEs, those powerful actors, agree to have these seemingly toothless NGOs, and how do these local NGOs transform the role of ME from part of the problem to part of the solution? So we actually currently with some co-authors, we trace the story back to a decade ago, and we found that these most multinational firms were unwilling to clean their supply chains. So in fact, around 10 years ago, this same group of Chinese NGOs, they already began target these multinational firms, and the vast majority did not respond at all. So these local NGOs tried to get other stakeholders on board, including these international NGOs, these MAEs, the home country NGOs, and also as these home country NGO to influence these home country customers to build this kind of alliance to get these MAEs on board. So from contention to collaboration. So it is indeed important to look into the evolution of this kind of collaborative relationship. And regarding the role of government, in fact, the 15 years ago, 10 years ago, the Chinese government is very reluctant to clean its value chains and prioritize the unbridled economic expansion. So ME and NGO collaboration play a very significant role in terms of filling the gap. But since 10 years ago, the Chinese government began to prioritize the environmental protection, and then we find that the main effect became weaker because not all MNEs are willing to clean their supply chains, and these local NGOs are also not that capable like the Western counterparts to address the environmental issues. Okay, so there's indeed important dynamics going on here. Yeah.
Thank you, Wenjie. Alvaro, as you know, my perspective is that consumers will often say they care about this stuff, but when you actually see what they're doing, it doesn't always prove that out. So to help us understand a little bit better why you think consumers are truly relevant in this phenomenon.
At the end of the day, multinationals are not entities; they are people. And they have the pressure to basically satisfy consumers with things that they think create value. And if they run it well, they basically capture some of that value. If we have a change in the consumer behavior, that's when multinationals are going to change. If otherwise you can just justify, well, yes, these are important things. However, our consumers don't really care. That I think is the wrong attitude. And it's not that every single consumer is going to care. And it's basically organizations among consumers, interest groups play a huge role. And this is where the NGOs can play a huge role in basically taking the ideas that concerns of society and basically placing them there. Governments, are they important? Yes, of course. I mean, I'm not discussing that they are not important, but as we saw the discussion, democracies are much more responsive to their citizens than totalitarian regimes. Nonetheless, totalitarian regimes are still responsive to their citizens because they want to stay in power. So a lot of this is basically people who are concerned about things. We stop consuming, we stop buying things that we don't think are appropriate, and as a result, companies basically react very quickly. And of course, employees want to work in companies that are having a better positive impact. The last thing you want to do is basically go home and it is, well, I just polluted all these rivers and all these people are going to get sick, but nonetheless, I'm happy here, going to have dinner with my family. That's not the way things work. This is society. These are social interactions. We have seen the change in attitudes towards society, the social impact and the environmental impact, and I think that's where many of these changes are happening.
I think that's a really good place to kind of close the conversation here. Maybe I could just make a comment or two, and that is to thank our three presenters very much for their insightful contributions. really, really fascinating. Alvaro, when you were speaking, there was one other stakeholder I think really plays a role in these dynamics, and that's the media. The media can amplify and provide platforms for what might otherwise not be particularly influential stakeholders. So that's another interesting dimension here. Again, before I turn things back to Stephanie, I want to remind you about the forthcoming JIB special issue, of which these 3 papers are part of. I want to mention that, as I did earlier, that we have an introductory article and 2 additional papers there. So as they come online, please do take a look at them. Encourage you to think more about this research area. I think it's really fascinating, and as I said earlier, has great practical and societal relevance. So thank you, Stephanie, for including me in this exchange, and thanks to all of our presenters. And I'll turn things back over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, I think Shehar's last question is a great ending question with a lot of thoughts for us all going back and think about that. This is the beauty of the complexity of ESG in global supply chain. So some of the things we already talked about, like host, home, country, and also ESG, this umbrella itself is also complex, right? So pollution, environmental issues are very different from many social issues, and then also like privacy. I think this is just leaves us a lot of really exciting topic to continue after this webinar. So thank you so much for all the panelists. Thank you for your generous sharing your insights with us. And then thank you everyone for joining us live today. Again, I hope you come home, walk away with this webinar with fresh and valuable insights that inspire your own research. As Jonathan said, the 3 papers we showcase today, we also have another 2 in the special issue, so do check it out. And the conversation and insights certainly do not stop here. So we will continue the conversation offline. And finally, big thank you to Tonga Kiak, Executive Director of AIB, and then also the digital motion team, Nicole Hare, Dan Rockstock, and many others behind the scene. The video recording of the webinars can be found in our website, AIB website. Go under events, you will find the link, or you can go to YouTube channel. Our podcast version of the webinars are also available in the Podbean pages, where you can stream through any of the service you like. I think that's it. Thank you so much, and I will see you in the next episode. Goodbye, everyone.